Picture this: a teenage peasant girl, dirt under her fingernails, straw in her hair, marches into the royal court and declares she's come to save France. The nobles laugh, until she does exactly that. A flame flickers in a war-torn land, kindled by a girl's unshakable faith. Her heart hears heaven's call, her courage defies empires. She is Joan, the Maid of Orléans. Imagine you're 17 years old. You can't read. You can't write. You've never traveled more than a few miles from your tiny village. Yet somehow, you're absolutely convinced that God himself has chosen you to save an entire kingdom from destruction. Sounds impossible? Delusional? Tell that to the English armies she shattered. Tell that to the king she crowned. Tell that to history itself. In the heart of France, a peasant girl kneels in a field, her eyes fixed on visions only she can see. The voices of saints echo in her ears, calling her to a destiny that will change the course of nations. She is Joan of Arc, the Maid of Orléans, and her story is one of the most extraordinary in all of human history. But this isn't just another tale of medieval heroics. This is the story of how an illiterate farm girl became the most feared warrior in Europe, how she defied every expectation of her time, and how she proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible is exactly what the world needs. Welcome, dear viewers, to a special edition of the Legends of History series, brought to you by the Legacy of History channel. Today, we journey back to the 15th century to unravel the tale of a young woman who led armies, crowned a king, and became a symbol of faith and courage for all time. Buckle up. This story will leave you breathless. The year is 1412. France is literally tearing itself apart. And into this nightmare, a baby girl is born who will either save the kingdom or die trying. Welcome to medieval France, where brothers murder brothers, mothers betray sons, and madness sits on the throne. In the tiny village of Domremy, nestled in the Lorraine region, Joan's story begins. But don't picture some peaceful fairy tale village. Picture a place where families barricade their doors at night, where the church bells ring not for prayer, but to warn of approaching raiders, where children grow up knowing that any day could be their last. This was Joan's world. And somehow, from this hellscape of war and betrayal, would emerge the most extraordinary leader in medieval history. The France into which Joan was born wasn't just at war, it was devouring itself from within. Imagine a kingdom so broken that the queen herself would rather see it ruled by foreign invaders than by her own son. This is the story of a nation's suicide, and one girl's refusal to let it die. Two royal factions sat on the Regency Council, locked in a feud so vicious it made Game of Thrones look like a family squabble, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. At the center of this storm sat Queen Isabeau, wife of King Charles VI. A man history remembers as Charles the Mad because of the fits of psychosis that had gripped him since the 1390. Imagine ruling a kingdom when your king sometimes thinks he's made of glass and refuses to let anyone touch him. The Armagnacs, led by the king's brother Louis, Duke of Orléans, had the queen's backing. These political conservatives wanted France to stay feudal and agricultural, stuck in the past while the world moved forward. But their enemies, led by the king's cousin John, Duke of Burgundy, had aligned themselves with England. His lands included Flanders, the booming textile center, and his English ties meant he wanted to modernize France with stronger cities and convert farmland into profitable sheep pastures. Then came the assassination that changed everything. In 1407, the Duke of Orléans was brutally murdered on the orders of the Duke of Burgundy. Civil war erupted instantly, and France lay bleeding and helpless, ripe for English conquest. Henry V of England saw his chance. In 1415, he invaded, and at the Battle of Agincourt that October, the French army was obliterated. While the Duke of Burgundy sat on the sidelines, French knights were cut down like wheat before a scythe. By 1420, France had essentially surrendered its own existence. The Treaty of Troyes named the English king and his heirs as successors to the French throne. In perhaps the most shocking betrayal in royal history, Queen Isabeau willingly disinherited her own 17-year-old son, the Dauphin Charles, long whispered to be illegitimate anyway. A marriage between French Princess Catherine of Valois and Henry V sealed England's claim. But Charles refused to accept his mother's betrayal. Fleeing Paris, he declared himself regent and set up a rival court in Bourges. France now had two kings, and neither could truly rule. By 1422, both Henry V and Charles VI were dead, leaving a 9-month-old baby as nominal ruler of England and France, while Charles still claimed the French throne from his exile in Bourges. Into this chaos, in the tiny village of Domremy, a girl named Joan was growing up, and she was watching and listening and preparing for something no one could have imagined. Joan's parents, Jacques d'Arc and Isabelle Reims, were simple folk trying to survive in impossible times. Jacques was a farmer and local official. Think of him as the village's combination mayor and tax collector, roles that made him both essential and occasionally hated. Isabelle taught Joan the women's work of the era: spinning wool, sewing, managing a household. But Joan was different from other village girls, dangerously different. While other children played with dolls or helped in the fields, Joan could be found kneeling in the church of Remy, praying with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. She absorbed every word from the priest about God, Jesus, and the saints, storing up these stories like weapons she might one day need. As a girl of her time and social class, Joan couldn't read or write. But don't mistake illiteracy for ignorance. In a world without books, people's memories were steel traps. Joan could recite biblical stories, local prophecies, and political gossip with perfect accuracy. Her mind was a library, and every conversation added another book to its shelves. She was preparing for something. She just didn't know what yet. At 13, most girls worry about chores and maybe catching the eye of a village boy. Joan started having conversations with archangels. The year, 1425. The age, 13. The moment. Everything changes forever. Picture this scene: a gang of mercenaries storms into Domremy, stealing cattle, terrorizing families, leaving destruction in their wake. Eventually the animals are recovered, but the message is clear. Nowhere is safe while foreign invaders occupy French soil. Joan watches this violence unfold. She sees her neighbors' fear, her parents' helplessness, her village's desperation, and something inside her breaks, or awakens. Because somewhere in the smoky ruins of that raid, a prophecy starts echoing in people's whispers. A prophecy supposedly made by Merlin himself, the legendary wizard of King Arthur. France will be lost by a woman, but it will be saved by a virgin from the borders of Lorraine. Everyone knows the first woman, Queen Isabeau, the mother who sold out her own country. But who could the second be? What virgin from Lorraine could possibly save an entire kingdom? Joan must have known that prophecy by heart, and deep down she must have wondered. Then it happened, the moment that would change the course of European history. Joan was working in her family's garden on a summer's day, probably thinking about nothing more dramatic than weeding vegetables or gathering herbs. The sun was warm, the air was peaceful, the world seemed normal. Thence the world exploded into light. A blinding radiance erupted near the church, so brilliant that Joan fell to her knees, shielding her eyes. When she could see again, she found herself face to face with a figure of such majesty that she instantly knew this was the archangel Michael, the warrior of God himself. But Michael wasn't alone. Two more figures materialized, Saints Catherine of Alexandria and Margaret of Antioch. Both had been teenagers when they died as martyrs for their faith. Both were now standing in Joan's garden, speaking directly to a 13-year-old peasant girl. What do you say when heaven itself shows up in your backyard? Joan fell to her knees in terror. The saints' voices were gentle but urgent. God had chosen her for a mission that would save France. She would drive the English invaders from French soil. She would see Charles crowned as the rightful king at Reims Cathedral. A teenage farm girl, leading armies, crowning kings. Most people would have assumed they were losing their minds. Joan assumed she was finding her destiny. The figures vanished, but their message burned in Joan's heart. Over the next 3 years, the voices returned again and again, becoming more insistent, more urgent. They told her she would lead French armies to victory. They showed her visions of battles won and cities liberated. They prepared her for a role no woman in history had ever played. Joan told no one about her visions. Not her parents, not her friends, not even the village priest. For 3 years she carried this impossible secret alone, waiting for the moment when heaven would call her to action. That moment was coming sooner than anyone could imagine. Joan's voices had become more insistent as the military situation deteriorated. In 1428, the English landed at Calais and claimed multiple towns, culminating in the siege of Orléans. On the Loire River, this strategic city was the gateway to central France. The English and their Burgundian allies controlled the rest of northern France, including Paris. Accompanied by a cousin, Joan went to the military garrison in Vaucouleurs, which was still loyal to Charles. Meeting with Robert de Baudricourt, the garrison captain, she asked for an escort to Chinon, where the Dauphin was stationed. De Baudricourt sent the teenager away, seeing only a peasant girl with an outlandish request. He underestimated her determination to fulfill the commands of the heavenly voices. A few weeks after returning home, the war came to Domremy. The Burgundians and English struck Vaucouleurs and the surrounding villages, punishing the residents for their continuing support for the Dauphin. Once again, Joan left Domremy for Vaucouleurs in January 1429. It would be the last time she saw home. Her next meeting with Captain de Baudricourt was aided by 2 knights, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy. They had been won over by her fervent belief in her God-given mission. Joan once again asked the garrison captain for safe passage through enemy territory to meet the Dauphin. She then predicted that Charles's forces were about to suffer a terrible defeat. Unbeknownst to either of them, hundreds of miles away at the Battle of Rouvray, the Dauphin's men were being routed by the English. Although de Baudricourt had once again dismissed Joan from their meeting, when news of the defeat reached him, he realized that her prediction had come true. De Baudricourt granted her wish. It would be a dangerous 300-mile journey to Chinon, but she would come with her 2 knights. One further means of protection was to disguise her as a man. Moved by her story, the people of Vaucouleurs banded together to provide her with clothing, a horse, and a sword. When Joan arrived at Chinon in early March, she was met with skepticism and suspicion. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was hesitant to receive her, and his advisors were openly hostile. After the bitterness of his mother's betrayal and the never-ending string of defeats and setbacks, he was willing to try anything. To test Joan's purported divine powers, he and a courtier exchanged places. The young woman, who had never seen the Dauphin before, immediately picked him out in the crowd of nobles. But Joan persisted, and in a private meeting with Charles, she reportedly revealed to him a secret prayer that he had made to God, convincing him of her divine mission. Chronicler Enguerrand Monstrelet notes her uncanny insight, swaying a doubtful court. While the details of their conversation have never been revealed, it eventually resulted in Joan being put front and center at the relief of the siege of Orléans. Charles' advisors wanted the young, illiterate peasant to be examined to ensure that she was neither witch nor heretic, which would detract from the French cause. Joan was sent to Poitiers, where learned theologians quizzed her on her faith, and she was secretly watched to ensure that her character was spotless. She both charmed and convinced her scrutinizers. She also showed herself to be no fool, was not intimidated, and held calmly yet firmly in her belief that she was an instrument of God. In April, the verdict came that Joan was a morally upstanding Christian. Whether she could lift the 6-month siege as promised was unknown. Some suggested that she be sent to Orléans, and if she died in the attempt, then so be it. With the Dauphin's blessing, Jean was given command of a small army and basic training in battle tactics before leaving with the relief force. Orléans marked Joan's ascent from peasant to legend. Orléans' walls, scarred by English cannons, stood defiant as Joan arrived. She dictated a letter to be sent to the English commander at Orléans, in which she offered them the chance to flee France before she and her army made them leave. She signed it La Pucelle, or the Maiden. You can only imagine the reception such a letter received. Such threats, and from a woman, a peasant at that. The English, however, would soon take a much humbler stand. At first, the French commanders at Orléans were reluctant to be led by an armored, teenaged girl riding a white charger and carrying a fluttering white banner bearing the names of Jesus and Mary. However, soldiers were often sentimental and superstitious. This was in Joan's favor. As she moved amongst them, something in the way she spoke and carried herself gave them confidence. She was the Maid of France, the embodiment of the Virgin Savior of the prophecies. She became their mascot. Her banner, fluttering above the fray, rallied captains like Jean de Dunois and Lahy. She urged assaults on key bastions, her presence turning despair into fervor, as Jean d'Orléans' journals attest. When the assault finally began, Joan seemed to be everywhere on the field at once, rallying the troops with her cries of "Au nom de Dieu," in the name of God. She was wounded, slightly, in the foot on the second day of the attack, and received a more serious injury when an arrow struck her shoulder as she clambered up a siege ladder at Les Tourelles. Rumors of her death swept through the ranks. The next day, she was back on the battlefield, doing her best to uplift the soldiers' hearts. When Les Tourelles fell, the siege was over, and the south bank of the Loire was regained. The French prevailed after 4 bloody days, breaking the siege in just 9 days and earning Joan the love and admiration of the French people. The English suffered heavy losses, yet considered it to be a setback rather than a defeat. Joan had been horrified by the carnage, yet she stood firm in her resolution to do God's holy work and drive the English from French shores. But Joan's triumphs had only begun. With the way into the north now reopened, the French pressed on with renewed morale and vigor. Over the next months, she led the French army to further victories, recapturing key towns and fortresses along the Loire Valley. Victory followed victory, and the Dauphin's confidence in Joan grew. In 5 days, the French moved the English out of the Loire Valley. The Battle of Patay was a massacre. The English put up little resistance and were cut down as they ran. Even though they were the enemy, Joan wept at their deaths. Her mere presence on the battlefield was said to inspire her soldiers to greatness and strike fear into the hearts of the English. Throughout her military campaigns, Joan remained steadfast in her faith and her sense of divine purpose. She insisted on strict moral discipline among her soldiers, forbidding them to loot, gamble, or swear, and requiring them to attend Mass regularly. She herself prayed frequently and urged others to do the same, believing that France's salvation depended on its spiritual as well as its military renewal. Reims crowned Joan's mission with divine vindication. Joan's greatest moment came on July 17, 1429, when she accompanied Charles VII to Reims for his long-delayed coronation. Charles was crowned in the traditional seat of the French kings, deep inside what had been enemy territory. As the Dauphin was anointed with holy oil and crowned King of France, Joan stood nearby, her banner held high. It was a scene of high drama and deep symbolism, marking the restoration of French sovereignty and the vindication of Joan's divine mission. The cathedral's ancient stones bore witness to a peasant girl's triumph, as chroniclers like Georges Chastelain recorded. Joan had done what the voices had asked of her. She had driven the English from key territories and seen Charles crowned at Reims Cathedral. As thanks, Charles ennobled her family and even granted tax-free status to her village, Domremy. However, she still felt she had work to do as the English remained in France, but Charles was in a more conciliatory mood. He wanted to negotiate peace with the Duke of Burgundy instead of attacking Paris, as Joan desired. She had been of immense use in gaining the throne, but now he had matters of state to consider. Seemingly, he would have been most happy if she just quietly disappeared, but that was not Joan's style. Within a short while, she went from being indispensable to royalty to gradually becoming a thorn in the new king's side. But even as Joan reached the height of her fame and influence, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. Her enemies at court, jealous of her popularity and suspicious of her growing power, began to plot against her. However, in September, the king's forces did attack Paris, which was a formidable target. Joan once again came under enemy fire when she took a crossbow arrow to the thigh. Charles called off the attack. It was the first defeat for French troops since Joan had joined them. Even with her influence greatly reduced, Joan continued to fight the English and their Burgundian allies. Some months later, in May 1430, she was captured at Compiègne during a skirmish. Her voices had warned her of such an event, saying it would be a long and unhappy period of imprisonment. Betrayal led to Joan's final stand. Burgundian politics, tangled with English ambitions, sealed her fate. Some historians say that Charles did not try to rescue her or pay a ransom. She was abandoned in a tower at Bourville Castle, while others report that his attempts at rescue failed and his feeble ransom offer was declined. Joan lingered there for months under constant threat of molestation by her jailers. She kept firmly to her habit of wearing men's clothing, despite efforts to convince her otherwise. Finally, in a fit of desperation, she flung herself from the tower and, amazingly, survived. Shortly after, in November 1430, she was sold to the English, who saw her as a dangerous heretic and a symbol of French resistance. By February 1431, Joan was on trial for her life, accused of heresy and witchcraft. She was put on trial by an ecclesiastical court in Rouen, charged with heresy, and dressing in men's clothing. Cross-dressing was forbidden by the Book of Deuteronomy. Even though great pains were taken to record everything that was said, her fate was sealed with only one possible outcome: death. A major obstacle in her defense hinged on her gender. Joan went on trial for two equally egregious transgressions. The first was that she claimed to have heard voices from God, heresy, and she had dressed in men's clothing. For months she was interrogated, threatened, and pressured to recant her visions and confess to her crimes. The simple fact was that Joan refused to bow to the church's authority, or more accurately, the authority of the men of the church. She withstood hours of questioning about her faith and the truthfulness of her visions with calmness and sharpness of wit that stunned. But it was all in vain. Joan remained steadfast in her convictions, even in the face of torture and death. "I place my trust in God," she declared to her judges. "I believe that God will not fail me." In the end, however, the court found her guilty and sentenced her to burn at the stake as a heretic. On the morning of May 30, 1431, Joan was led to the stake in the Vieux Marche. As the flames rose around her, she asked for a cross to be held before her eyes and repeatedly called out the name of Jesus. Her body was burnt 3 times until it was reduced to ashes, which were then tossed into the River Seine by the English. Her last words, according to the eyewitnesses, were, "My voices were from God. Everything I have done was by God's order. I do not regret anything I have done." She had fought for France and her king, yet still been betrayed. Joan's execution shocked and horrified many across Europe, even among her former enemies. The English, who had hoped to destroy her reputation and demoralize the French, instead found that they had created a martyr and a saint. Her mother, Isabel, never gave up the fight to clear her daughter's name. In the years that followed, Joan's memory was kept alive by those who had known and loved her, and her story was told and retold as an example of faith, courage, and patriotism. Some 25 years later, in 1456, Charles allowed a second trial to take place where Joan was exonerated. A new trial was ordered by Pope Calixtus III, which overturned the original verdict and declared Joan an innocent martyr. But it would be nearly 500 years before she was officially canonized by the Catholic Church in 1920, after a long and thorough process of investigation and discernment. Her feast day is the anniversary of her death, May 30. Joan's image endured in French culture, from medieval ballads to Victor Hugo's poems and Luc Besson's films, a beacon of resistance and faith. Today, Joan of Arc stands as one of the most remarkable and inspiring figures in all of history. Her story transcends time and place, speaking to something deep and universal in the human spirit. She reminds us that greatness can come from the most unlikely of places, that faith can move mountains, and that a single person, armed with conviction and courage, can change the course of nations and the world. But as we celebrate Joan's extraordinary life and legacy, let us also remember the deeper truths that her story reveals. Joan's voices, her visions, her unshakable sense of purpose, these were not the products of delusion or madness, but of a profound and authentic spiritual experience. They were a call to action, a summons to serve something greater than herself, to risk everything for the sake of a higher truth. And in answering that call, Joan showed us what it means to be truly human. She showed us that we are all capable of extraordinary things, that we all have a part to play in the great unfolding of history and the great work of love and justice in the world. She showed us that the path of the hero is not easy, that it often leads through suffering and sacrifice, but that it is the only path worth taking, the only way to be true to ourselves and to the God who made us. So let us take courage from Joan's example. Let us listen for the voices that speak to us in the depths of our hearts, calling us to be more than we are, to serve more than ourselves. Let us be willing to stand up for what we believe in, even when the whole world seems against us. Let us be ready to face the fires of opposition and persecution, knowing that the truth cannot be burned away, that the light cannot be extinguished. And let us never forget that we are all part of a greater story, a story of hope and redemption, of faith and freedom, of love and sacrifice. It is the story that Joan of Arc lived and died for, the story that still echoes through the ages, calling us to be our best and bravest selves. This is the legacy of the Maid of Orléans, the peasant girl who became a soldier, a saint, and a symbol of the human spirit at its most indomitable. May her example inspire us, now and always, to listen to the voice of God within us and to follow it wherever it may lead. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of history and the depths of the soul. If you've been moved and inspired by Joan's story, we invite you to like this video and to subscribe to the Legacy of History channel. There are so many more stories to tell, so many more heroes to discover, and we can't wait to share them all with you. Until next time, dear viewers, remember the words of Joan of Arc. I am not afraid. I was born to do this. May you find the courage to do what you were born to do, and may the legacy of this remarkable woman live on through all of us.